It's the cheese!
Across his many amazing adventures, Spyro has shown himself to be a true hero. He never stalls, wins every brawl, and punts used like footballs. Yet amongst all the wacky scenarios he's been entangled in, only a single one has ever managed to turn his world completely upside down. 2002 was a momentous year for our purple pal. Much like the Wrath of Cortex was for Crash, Enter the Dragonfly harkened a new era for Spyro. No longer would the tiny terror be shackled beneath the fetters of Insomniac's watchful eye. For now, he would be bound to two developers, with no unreasonably demanding parties interfering whatsoever. What could go wrong? More than you'd imagine. As the sequel to Year of the Dragon, Enter the Dragonfly was intended to continue in the series' initial trajectory of exploring enchanting locales, hoarding gems, and furthering Hunter's weird alien obsession. Yet, due to being rushed to release, Enter the Dragonfly was both figuratively, and quite literally, half the game of its predecessor. Bugs, glitches, lengthy load times, nightmares. There's a reason why a majority of the fanbase often deems this as one of the series' bleakest moments. However, since I took the time to provide one of Crash's weaker entries a second shot, it seems only fair for me to cast my former judgments aside and give Spyro another chance. Besides, Enter the Dragonfly couldn't possibly be as rotten as I remember it being. Oh no. At the Year of the Dragon's finale, Spyro and his pals are participating in a grand ceremony where all the wee little dragons meet their brand new Dragonfly companions. Which, on the surface, is a pretty cool setup. The first game never really explained what sparked our duo's curious team-up. So now we know their meeting was likely just pure destiny, since it's a dragonfly's instinct to serve as a punching bag for dragons or something. Nice. Yet apparently Spyro can never catch a break and enjoy himself for a solitary moment without some magicking mongrel showing up and wrecking the party. And this time it's Ripto and his two cronies back in all their glory. Knowing how essential dragonflies are to a young dragon's well-being, the saucy little shrimp uses his scepter to snag up every single dragonfly for himself, thus leaving all the youngsters, and by association Spyro, completely vulnerable. But fortunately for our hero, Ripto's spell backfires, scattering all the dragonflies across the dragon realms.
Scattered!
And Sparks is just buzzing around in the adjacent building. How convenient. After their brief reunion, Spyro sets off to rescue all the lost dragonflies and once again roast Ripto. So really, things are off to a promising start. Well, excusing the unsettling character models. Bones aren't apparently important in this universe. From multiple perspectives, Enter the Dragonfly is a peculiar experience. And while there's a heap of reasons contributing to this, a substantial factor can be accredited to its performance. Typically, I prefer to cover these sort of topics later on in my videos, but Enter the Dragonfly is one of those rare exceptions where things oftentimes wind up fantastically terrible. So with that said, let's get it over with. If you happen to be the type of person that's easily frustrated by glitches and bugs, spare yourself the hassle of playing this game. I'm usually the type of person who's prone to overlook such problems when they pop up, but the issues herein are particularly frequent and obnoxious. The frame rate in certain levels like Cloud 9 is a downright headache inducer. And this isn't an exaggeration. Exploring this world hurts. Yet, it's not only the frame rate that's consistently stuttering. There's an epidemic of delayed reactions with the enemies, as well as everything else. Combined with some noticeable input delay, this causes Spyro to feel rather clunky throughout the entire game. And even if you're capable of stomaching these issues, you still have to worry about the game freezing on you. There's several other annoying traits I've yet to brush over, but honestly, I don't see any further point continuing this train of thought. The performance is abysmal, and serves as an ideal example of why you should never rush out such a woefully incomplete project. And while there's a sort of charm and humor to be found given just how buggy this game can be, I'd much rather sacrifice all these zany moments for a reliably running Spyro 4. But obviously, that's not an option, so if you're willing, try to appreciate it for the mess it is, as this game is unintentionally hilarious, such as this bug in Honey Marsh's music. Masterpiece. However, in spite of its suboptimal performance, I somehow didn't hate Enter the Dragonfly by the end. Once adjusted to its not-so-shortcomings, I came to realize Enter the Dragonfly was simply a smaller, mirrored version of Year of the Dragon. In turn, the gameplay is precisely what you'd expect from the prior entries, which is definitely something I can get behind again. The cycle of running around, collecting gems, completing side quests, operating a cruddy vehicle, blacking out, and repeating is always a joy. So perhaps Enter the Dragonfly can redeem itself after all. As the intro implies, Spyro's primary objective here is to locate all the lost Dragonflies before they're abducted by the invading Riptox. Essentially, Dragonflies are this game's version of orbs or dragon eggs, but boasting one key difference. Barring those treated as rewards for completing challenges and those within Honeymarsh who are apparently blind, Spyro must first pursue and ensnare these stray Dragonflies with his bubble breath before reclaiming them. Which, on paper, sounds like a decent idea, until you account for the Dragonflies' incessant taunting and the bubble's horrendous hitbox. I'm very mixed on these tiny twerps. When the hitboxes actually work, catching them is a much more rewarding process than automatically acquiring them. But on the flip side, when the bubbles don't respond correctly, it becomes an incredibly tedious ordeal trapping those pesky gabbers. However, what's likely Enter the Dragonfly's most noteworthy contribution was the addition of different breath abilities. Towards the beginning, Bianca combines her magic along with the mystical powers of the Dragon Spirit, who's apparently a sentient speaking statue, in order to grant Spyro the ability to spew out various elements, such as ice and electricity. But because of a slip-up, which seems to happen an awful lot here, Spyro must fetch the various runes scattered about before his hunky ancestor can bestow these said abilities.
Scattered!
Regardless of a few gripes I have, such as how seldom certain abilities are actually necessary, not to mention the aforementioned bubble physics, the power-ups are a welcome inclusion and are, if nothing else, fun to use. The only recurring complaint I have is that most of them are rarely utilized in an interesting way outside of their designated roles. Bubbles catch dragonflies and make a cool sound. And outside of a few enemies you encounter later on, the latter two abilities serve a somewhat singular purpose as well. Given the game's brevity, this isn't really a problem per se, it just feels like more could have been done to make these feel special or more rewarding. Like the wing shield. Successfully landing a projectile is so incredibly satisfying, especially after you've been waiting several minutes for it to work. But as demonstrated from its level designs, Enter the Dragonfly primarily serves as a continuation of everything we've seen thus far, as opposed to anything unprecedented. And structurally, this works pretty well. Many levels are genuinely enjoyable to journey across and feature unique objectives such as having to rescue captive yetis, warding off a UFO, or thawing the frozen masters. Yet, there's one thing that really holds them back: the awkward scale. Fortunately, a few worlds never pose this issue, but for those that do, it's abundantly obvious, especially if you've played any of the prior games. Oftentimes, Spyro and the enemies are just too small to operate well within their spacious environments, which causes the level's progression in particular stretches to be unbearably slow. Hope you like long, empty hallways. Even the best of worlds really begin to wear off their welcome towards the end, and in the case for the weaker inclusions, they're an utter chore to complete. If the layouts were simply compressed, the game would instantly flow better, which really annoys me. But not nearly as much as this accursed tank. Along Spyro's journey, he encounters a plethora of various challenges, from having to access control towers to bombing Ripto factories, and they all range from anywhere between decent to irredeemable. So let's take a look at some that stand out. Once more, Speedways make their triumphant return, and they're exactly what you'd expect: a weaker version of Year of the Dragons, which isn't a deal breaker by any means. While the controls respond noticeably worse and the missiles are practically worthless, the time attacks and races themselves are pretty engaging if you can overlook their flaws. Unlike this hunk of junk. The tank might be the worst operating vehicle ever, somehow even sinking below Smokey and the Bandicoot's disgraceful performance. It's slow, the aiming stinks, you dominate your foes from a distance, you get creamed by them in any other position, and the environment's hitbox constantly obstructs your shots. It's atrocious. I pray this never returns in the future, as it's really that egregious. Though, the one thing I wouldn't mind seeing again are the slides, strangely enough. These have held up surprisingly well and offer some quality platforming despite their meager concept and occasionally buggy physics. Call me crazy, but this is my favorite activity in the game, and drove Honeymarsh into becoming simultaneously one of the most pleasing and infuriating levels of all time. Simply put, you could just divvy every challenge into one of four categories. There's the surprisingly good, then there's the inoffensively mediocre, the remarkably bad, and lastly, pain.
You know, for fun.
You are a masochist. So, from a gameplay perspective, I think Enter the Dragonfly is an amalgamation of various traits. There's some great ideas sprinkled throughout, engaging moments to be had, and in many ways, it's what you'd want to see from the series. But there's so much muck you have to wade through every step. Its positive characteristics and the nostalgia from re-experiencing a childhood classic made the trials worth bearing for me personally. Yet for someone who's never touched this game, I really don't know what to say. Who knows, maybe I'm speaking too soon. Perhaps the game's other characteristics will shine through. The story's awful. While it feels somewhat unfair to critique Enter the Dragonfly's plot, given that it was severely hashed together due to time constraints, man, it peeves me. Alright, in context, the series isn't usually known for complex characters and riveting plot lines, so I can accept its lack thereof. However, this is so bare bones, even compared to Spyro 1 standards, and the little story it actually does have is riddled with issues. Firstly, coming from someone who really loves the squat little sorcerer and his sinister antics, Ripto is completely wasted here, and feels somewhat out of character. As Spyro 2 made abundantly clear, the primary incentive for Ripto's intense hostility towards Spyro was that he hates dragons. So having a personal vendetta against Spyro after their little squabble is perfectly in character. He's despised him from the very beginning. Yet if Ripto's entire purpose for setting up shop in Avalar was solely because it was a dragon-free zone, why in the world would he willingly follow his arch-nemesis into the Dragon Realms? Now, I realize Ripto was initially supposed to team up with Nasty Nork, and this would have helped explain his presence and ultimately his motives. But alone, this is really confusing. Ripto claims that stripping dragons of their dragonflies will in turn render them helpless, and while this is perhaps applicable to Spyro and the other adolescents, there's no indication that this should even affect the elders in the slightest. So, congratulations, you just earned yourself the #1 enemy status to Dragonkind, the very type of beings you're apparently trying to get away from before. However, if what he's saying does apply to the Elders, that doesn't mesh all too well with everything we've learned thus far from the first title in Year of the Dragon. I suppose you could argue Ripto might have wanted the Dragonflies to fuel his magic, but why? He already has the scepter again in the opening cutscene, Crush and Gulp are apparently back from the dead, he commands an entire military of dinosaurs seemingly out of nowhere, and we're provided no reason to believe Dragonflies would even make Ripto any more powerful than he already is any time in the game.
What do I want this time?
That's what I've been trying to figure out. You could ask the same from the story as a whole. Besides reclaiming the Dragonflies and learning Ripto lacks depth perception, in the grand scheme of things, nothing happened. Hunter and Bianca are practically non-existent, the Jolly Green Giant's given no backstory, the only scene reminding you there's an iota of a story is awkwardly placed, and the festival continues on as normal. It's so weird, but I've griped and overreacted long enough. So let's look at the positives, as there are some, believe it or not. While the story is utterly dysfunctional, the levels themselves still evoke that whimsical charm the series is renowned for. There's some cool nods to the prior titles sprinkled throughout, and the characters that are introduced are pleasant enough. Besides the appalling facial animations and the morbid dialogue with the pigs, none of these NPCs really stand out all that much, but they do their job at bringing some life to these worlds if nothing else. Much like the art style. Overall, Equinoxe and Check 6 at least managed to capture the look of Insomniac's worlds. Regardless of Enter the Dragonfly's wretched performance and conflicting gameplay, I nonetheless find its worlds to be some of the most immersive in the series. The themes are both enchanting and distinct, providing each level with a unique vibe in a similar fashion to their predecessors. And Stewart Copeland's soundtrack really elevates them to their peak potential. Without fail, Copeland's music perfectly encapsulates the personality of each world. Both it and the art direction work together so uncannily well, to the point where I question, what would Enter the Dragonfly have been like had it been what its creators envisioned? For such a brief game retaining most of its predecessor's signature attributes and changing very little, Enter the Dragonfly is surprisingly complex, though not in a favorable way. While I neglected to mention several points earlier, such as Sparks' needless handholding and the lousy writing, there are already ample enough reasons given for why this entry is an unfortunate wreck. Yet, there are hints of something special nestled within this husk of a game. So it makes me wonder, what would Enter the Dragonfly been like had Equinoxe and Check 6 been able to accomplish what they had set out to do? Even in its severely underdeveloped state, Enter the Dragonfly manages to feel like a successor to Insomniac's games, has moments of thoroughly entertaining gameplay, some promising level designs, an effective art direction, and a mesmerizing soundtrack. Now, I won't argue on these grounds alone that this is a good entry in the series, as there's so many detractors holding it back. Terrible frame rates, innumerable bugs and glitches, wretched controls, and the dissatisfying story for just a taste. For those reasons, I'd never actually recommend it to most people, as that'd be inflicting a serious injustice upon them. Yep, for the right kind of person, I do think Enter the Dragonfly is a worthwhile investment, and I salute the developers' apparent efforts. Whereas their project might forever lie in infamy, I can acknowledge that many of its flaws were merely products of its rushed nature. And if all had gone according to their wishes, Spyro 4 would never have become the tragic entry we all know it to be. Of course, this is just speculation. It might still have flopped. Nevertheless, for the few elements that do play in its favor, Enter the Dragonfly proves its worth in the end. Kinda. And that concludes my review of Enter the Dragonfly, one of the most conflicting games I've ever played. If you enjoyed this video, I'd greatly appreciate your support by giving it a like and subscribing to the channel for more content. Also, I'd love to hear about your own experiences with Enter the Dragonfly, as I'm certain many of you have some interesting tales to tell. As always, thank you all for watching this video. God bless and happy gaming.
Excuse me, oh short one. Sir, short one.
When'd you learn to speak?